Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio with another solo mode review. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the solo mode for Living Forest, coming from designer Oscar Christensen and publisher Ludonaut Games. In Living Forest, you are playing a nature spirit, trying to save the forest from the fiery flames of a baddie. Well, that's the theme anyway. Let's head over to the table, I'll show you how the solo variant for the game works, then we'll come back here and I'll let you know what I think. Alright, here we see a starting setup for a solo game of Living Forest, and I'm not going to go into a heavy rules teach here. I will link to the original video for the multiplayer game of Living Forest if you want to get a little bit more in depth. I'm just going to be talking primarily about the differences between the solo game and the multiplayer game. One of the things that you may notice right off the bat is that we've got a number of fire tokens that are laid out for, they're basically a round tracker. There are going to be 11 rounds in the game. And at the beginning of every round, you're going to be placing the leftmost fire token or tokens onto the Circle of Spirits board here. All right, so at the beginning of round one, you just place that 2 value out there. The other thing to take note of is that in this case, I'm playing as the kind of blue or purple spirit here, and I start on this spot. And the kind of AI, if you want to call it that, it's not really an AI opponent, but is over there. You only have 2 of your bonus markers. You don't use the fire, and you take the 2 that are not fire of the AI color, and you place those by the side of the spirit board there. All right. The other thing you have to keep in mind is a level of difficulty that you want to play the game as. I'm showing you right now the standard level of difficulty. You could increase the level of difficulty. You can make it a little bit easier by starting with fragment tiles. I am not. The other thing to point out is that in the solo game, there is a smaller deck of the Fire Varan cards. There are only 7 here, and one of the losing conditions is taking the last of the Fire Varan cards. So let's talk about that really briefly. There are only 2 ways to win. You can win by having the 12 protective trees. You start with 1, so 11 more trees that you would purchase throughout the game, or by having 12 of the sacred flower symbols visible both on your board and in cards on your card row. There is a third winning condition in the multiplayer game that does not apply in the solo game, and that is the fire tiles. You cannot win through fire tiles in the solo game. All right, but everything else works very similarly. So again, the last thing to talk about losing is if you take the last of the Fire Varan cards, if you place an 8th fire tile on the Circle of Spirits, or if the other spirit passes you and takes your last victory tile, you lose also. When you pass the opponent, you gain one of theirs. When they pass you, they'll take one of yours. So as long as they don't jump over you, and take your last tile, you're okay there. All right, so beginning of the round, you go ahead and you put that fire token out there, and then you're going to do what you would normally do, where you're flipping over the cards and you are gaining symbols that you can potentially use to take action or actions depending upon when you stop in your line. So right now, all of these cards are what they call neutral cards. They don't have any symbol here in the upper left. So I'm going to keep going. So far, looking okay. Actually looking quite good here so far. Keep going. Now, I've got my first card that shows this symbol here. If ever 3 of these show, I have to stop immediately and only could take 1 action. If less than 3 of these are showing, I can take 2 actions. So I'm going to keep going until at least 1 more of those pops out, which it did right there. All right. I'm choosing to stop here because I want to be able to take 2 actions. And as I said, this works exactly the same as in the multiplayer game. The one small exception, I suppose, would be that you've got a smaller pool of the Sacred Tree cards that you would have to purchase, but you're not really competing with anybody, so it doesn't really matter. So let's say I wanted to do that. I'd have 2, 3, 4 to spend on a tree. Perhaps I wanted to get one of those trees, and I would place it orthogonally to my starting tree. I can put it right there. And now I can do a second action. Perhaps I want to extinguish that fire. Let's say I do that. I could also have purchased another forest spirit, but I want to extinguish that fire because it's not good to leave fire there in the multiplayer game, and it's definitely not good to leave fire there in the solo game, because what happens is during the circle of spirits period, if there are any fires left, you move the other spirit 2 spaces forward, getting closer to jumping you. If there are none left, you just move it 1, and I toppled him over here. Here we go. He would just move 1. All right. Also, just like normally, if you have a fire and you don't have whatever fire's left, if you don't have that much water, you're going to have a problem there as well. And that still applies in the solo game. All right. You would have to add those fire variant cards to your discard stack. Right now, I don't have to worry about that. All right. So that's how the game's going to play out in the solo game. You're going to go through each round adding the fire token or tokens. As you can see, it gets very, very challenging to deal with all of those fire tokens. You can still use these fragment tokens just like you can in the multiplayer game, but you do have to kind of keep your focus on getting one of those 2 winning conditions, which are all of the trees built out, or to have enough of these sacred flower token showing that you also gain that winning condition without hitting one of the losing conditions. All right, well, that's an overview of how the solo game plays out and how it differs from the multiplayer game. Let's head back over and I'll let you know what I think. Okay, hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea on how the solo variant plays out for Living Forest. The first thing I want to do is talk about some solo benchmarks. These are some high-level ideas that I like to consider when I am choosing a solo game to get off the shelf or not. The first thing is a win-loss condition. Does it have a beat your high score variant? Are you playing against an automated opponent? And in the case of Living Forest, it's not a high score variant. There is a clear win-loss condition, and you kind of sort of have an opponent, but not in the traditional sense. So in the multiplayer game of Living Forest, there were 3 potential winning conditions that you could try to fulfill. In the solo game, it keeps 2 of those 3 winning conditions. And so you have 2 potential winning conditions and a number of losing conditions. And so it's a clear win-loss. You're kind of sort of playing against an automated opponent in the sense that you've got another little figure on the travel board that represents an opponent, but it's not anything you have to really administer. You're not having to administer for an AI opponent. And so this works very well, I feel, in this game. I clearly know whether I've won or lost, but I don't have to do administration on an AI turn. The other thing I like to talk about is setup and teardown. And in the case of Living Forest, there is a fair amount of setup to do. You have to kind of get the correct number of the protective trees to place in the little cardboard stands, or you don't have to have the stands, but they're there, so why not use them? That takes a little bit of time getting the decks shuffled and in the right spot, but it's not an over-the-top amount of time for the length of game. I feel like it is reasonable, even though it's a little longer than I'd like, but it's a reasonable amount of time to set up and tear down the game based upon how long the game itself plays out. And then the last thing I want to talk about in the benchmarks is rules. And right off the bat, I want to point out that there are no solo rules printed in the rule book for at least the first edition. I'm assuming I'm playing on a first edition copy. In the first edition, there are no solo rules in the box. And actually, as a matter of fact, the player count on the box does not reflect that it plays solo. It shows 2 to 4 players on the box. However, there are official solo rules that you can get on Board Game Geek for sure, and potentially on the publisher website. I haven't checked that, but oftentimes they will also have those on the publisher website. But they are freely available. They're not long. You can print them out. I don't think you even have to print them out once you figure out or once you learn how the game plays. It's not something I feel like you're going to have to reference much. I haven't found myself having to reference it past the first time I played a solo game. And so the rules as they are clear. They're well written. There's not a lot of them. There's not a huge variance between the core rules of the game and what you have to do in the solo mode. So I feel like the rules as they are quite good, but just be aware they're not printed in the box. Next thing I want to talk about is art and components. And first, something that I did not love, and then the aspects I liked. This may seem a little nitpicky, and perhaps it is, but I found myself getting frequently frustrated with the cardboard standees of the forest spirits that you're moving around the travel board. I find myself, when I'm moving one of them, to pick it up a little bit and kind of move it from spot to spot. I suppose if you slid them, it wouldn't be an issue, but there are times when you're supposed to be jumping over each other. And what I found happened a lot of times is that the way these cardboard standees are designed, when I would pick one up, either to move it to the next space or certainly to jump, the little standee base would just kind of fall. They're just cardboard, they slot into each other. Is that a big deal? No, it's not a big deal. Did it annoy me? Yeah, it annoyed me. So I figured I'd mention it. It may not be an issue to you. You could probably, I don't know, glue them or something, although that seems like a little much. But anyway, I figured I would mention that. On the positive aspect, I really do think it is a lovely looking game, especially with the art on those Forest Guardian cards. I really do like the look of the game. Even the small amount of art that are on the protective trees are nice, and the fire kind of depicts the danger. So you've got kind of the bucolic forest, and then you've got the fire, that kind of juxtaposition. I do think it looks nice on the table. It takes up a fair amount of table space just by having individual player boards and that big kind of travel board, and you've got the little board to put the cards and the Forest Guardian cards, and you've got a little board to put the fire cards. But they're nice quality, and they look nice. So the table space, I think it's a fair trade-off. For the overall solo experience, first off, the things that did not work as well for me, and then the things I did like. First of all, in my experience, I feel like this is a difficult solo variant at any level. Now, there are easy ways to adjust the difficulty, and they mention these in the solo rule. So you can, to start the game off easier, you could start with a couple of those fragment tokens. That's going to make things easier for you to manage and mitigate on your card line that you draw. So you can make it easier that way. I played almost exclusively on the normal mode, which was just playing the game as it was described in the setup for the rules. You can make it harder, and much, much harder, quite easily by adjusting a number of things, fire and things along those lines. But I found that even on the normal difficulty, for sure, the challenge was quite high for me as a solo gamer. And so I just do want to mention that I don't feel like this is a cakewalk. Some people like that. For some people, they want a really hard solo variant. Just be aware, this is, I feel, one of the harder ones that I've played. Also, I feel like the solo variant can feel a bit constrictive in the sense that fires are going to be a constant threat. And I understand why. I think that that's really the engine that drives the solo game, is having those constant addition of the fire tokens. You can see what's coming, how much is coming. It also works as a round timer, which is kind of nice. But there's that constant threat of fire without that now being a winning condition. And so you can't just concentrate on putting out the fire. You have to concentrate on it, but you can't just concentrate on that. You also have to get another 11 protective trees out, because you start with 1, or get 12 of the sacred flowers. And so I guess what that brings about is this sense of, okay, I've got to deal with fire. Maybe I can go a round or two where I'm not putting out the fire, but if you go much beyond that, you're going to have problems, because there's a smaller deck. I believe there's only 7 of those fire cards that you start the game with in solo. So you can't just grab a bunch of those cards. They're doing more than just clogging up your deck. They're also a loss condition in the solo game. And so you can't ignore the fire by any means. They get progressively worse and worse. But you also have to get trees out there, or those sacred flowers. Yes, that's the challenge. That's the point. But I do feel like it does constrict your decision space a little bit. In my opinion, you can't go more than a round or two, I feel, without getting two actions every round. Because if you just have one action, if you're really pushing your luck on that card line and you're stuck with one action and you have to do that more than once or twice, I don't really think you've got much of a shot in the solo game. So it does feel a little bit more constrictive than the standard version of the game. Now, the things that I do like. I mentioned that the solo variant doesn't add any additional components to the game. And I think that that's actually good. It still feels very much like the core experience that you get in the multiplayer game is still kind of intact here. And you're also not, as I mentioned earlier, having to administer much at all other than your own turn. You're focusing mostly on what you're doing, your winning conditions. The only thing you really have to do is add those fire tokens at the beginning of the round and deal with moving the little AI, if you want to call it that, spirit on the travel board either 1 or 2 spaces. That's about it. You're really just focusing on your game. And I do like that, especially in a game of this length, when the vast majority of the time that you're taking, you're focusing on your board, your cards, your strategy. So that's a big thing. The biggest plus for me is that my favorite aspect of this game in general is that core flipping of the cards mechanism where you can push your luck a bit and you're trying to kind of improve that by getting more of those Forest Guardians when you can and kind of tailoring it to what you're trying to do. I really like that aspect of the game, and that is kept straight out in this solo game. I would have been disappointed if that aspect of the game had been kind of watered down or manipulated and adjusted in any significant way. But it's not. It really works exactly the same in the solo game. And since that's my favorite part of the game, it means that I still enjoy the solo variant of the game, even with those negatives that I mentioned of feeling a bit constricted and the difficulty level. So with all that being said, this is a solo variant that I can recommend. I am recommending it. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10, which is a seal of approval. Now, it doesn't get higher than that for a couple of reasons. First of all, those 2 negative aspects that I mentioned knocked it down a bit. I also don't know if it's going to have a tremendous amount of plays in it. I don't know that there's a huge difference from one game to the next. You're kind of doing the same thing. You know, of course, the cards that you get into your deck are going to change things out, but you're essentially kind of tackling the same puzzle over and over again. There's not a lot of variability in there. And so that is something that brings the score down a bit. However, I do recommend it as a solo variant. Inevitably, I get asked the question, and I understand the question, would you recommend this only for a solo game? Well, that gets into this idea of value proposition, and I'm usually very hesitant to mention those in my reviews because that depends on so many personal circumstances. Would I buy this strictly as a solo game? Maybe. I don't know exactly. I do like it a lot as a multiplayer game, and so that made it, a simple thing for me. The solo is a nice addition to that. Would I get it strictly as a solo game? I don't know, because it depends on how many plays you're looking for. If you're looking for years and years of play, probably not. If you're looking for 5 to 10 good solid solo plays and that's good enough for you, then maybe that would work. All right, well, that's it for me. This is Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.